According to the Africa Report, Foreign Minister Lavrov begins a cross-Africa tour to sweeten leaders. Their language, not mine. Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov is in Congo, Brazzaville this week. He will also be visiting Egypt, Uganda, and Ethiopia as he engages in face-to-face talks with African leaders in an attempt to bolster support for Russia on the international stage. For insight into this, we turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So your thoughts about Foreign Minister Lavrov and this trip to a number of African nations?
Well, I have inferred from my reading of the corporate media here in the United States, particularly the New York Times, that there may be a positive shift taking place. I recall the time of the non-aligned movement, which tried to stake out a position not necessarily close to Moscow, certainly not necessarily close to U.S. imperialism. And this was greeted with derision in the New York Times in particular. Matter of fact, they always refer to it, if you go back and look at the editions of the 1980s, as the movement that professes non-alignment, as if that's not a real concept. But of late, with regard to how African nations are stacking up concerning this Ukraine crisis, the New York Times seems to be saying that it's a victory for African nations to try to keep equidistance from Moscow and Washington, which in a sense is a turn from the phase of the non-aligned movement. Now, with regard to Mr. Lavrov's trip to Ethiopia, folks need to realize that relations between Russia and Ethiopia for decades, if not centuries, Ethiopia was the only independent African nation. And their warm relations are stretching back decades, if not centuries, particularly because Ethiopia held itself as a so-called Christian regime, as did Russia. Russia and Ethiopia had conflict with Ottoman Turkey, the major Muslim power, only in Europe, but of course it ruled Egypt for the longest period as well. And we all know about the conflicted relations between Egypt and Ethiopia that are still bubbling to the surface. And so when you had the attempt by the Italians in the 1890s to overthrow independent Ethiopia, the reasons why that venture failed was because Ethiopia was armed to the teeth by Russia, which helped to maintain Ethiopia's independence. Ethiopia also received assistance from Moscow in the 1930s when Italy tried to do the same thing again. When you had a short-lived so-called communist regime under Mengistu Haile Mariam in Ethiopia. In the 1970s, after the overthrow of His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie, you had the rise of a short-lived so-called Marxist regime in Addis Ababa headed by Mengistu Haile Mariam, who then was supported by the Soviet Union. And so these relations between Moscow and Addis Ababa are rather deep and pervasive. And there is consternation in Addis Ababa as we speak, because there is a feeling that when Addis Ababa was dealing with this crisis in the Tigray region, Addis did not feel that it was supported adequately by the United States in particular. In fact, the charge from Addis Ababa is that the United States was trying to interfere in Ethiopia's internal affairs because of apprehension about Ethiopia's relations with China. And you know that also on this itinerary was a trip to the Republic of the Congo, not the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but the smaller Congo Brazzaville. And some of us recall that during the Cold War period, That regime was known as the People's Republic of the Congo. It housed Black Panthers from the United States in exile, and it still maintains this residual sympathy towards Moscow because of its close relationship with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And the same holds true for Egypt, where Sergey Lavrov also visited, because we know that under the patriotic Egyptian leader, G.A. Nasser, when the United States collaborated with Israel against this regime, what helped to keep the regime afloat was solidarity from the socialist camp, headed by the Soviet Union. So there's a residual sympathy from Moscow there as well. And of course, the Soviet Union helped to build the Aswan Dam, very important to Egypt's development, when Washington turned his back on Egypt. So I'm afraid to say that there are many in this country who are not up to speed when it comes to evaluating this trip, and therefore, as so often happens, they'll be left sprawling in the dust.
I was looking over it, and I went online and I saw pictures of Sergey Lavrov. I believe he was at the Arab League. He was in the Middle East, and you would have thought that he was a superstar when he walked in, because there was a line of all of these leaders with big smiles on their hands, waiting to shake his hand, on their faces, waiting to shake his hands. And I just contrasted that with, and let me add this. And we find out that shortly after Joe Biden left Saudi Arabia and kind of got dissed there, shall we say, that the Crown Prince was on the phone with Putin, talking about how great their friendship was, and saying, "Oh no, we're going to keep these oil prices up." It seems to me that the Biden administration is simply not able to have the kind of relationships with even their traditional allies in the Middle East that Russia has at this point.
Well, the problem is, as you know more than most, is that the United States and its allies, they're used to having a relationship with Africa and the Arab countries in particular, of that as the rider to the horse, with the North Atlantic countries being the rider and the rest of us being the horse. And the time has long since passed for that archaic antediluvian approach to disappear, but the roots are too deep. And then there are the contemporary issues. You mentioned the Arab League. Well, we all know that the Saudis, who are a power in the Arab League, are also in a de facto alliance with Russia in terms of OPEC Plus, which Mr. Biden discovered to his dismay during his ill-fated trip to Saudi Arabia just a few days ago. And so there's going to have to be a lot of adjustment by the North Atlantic countries, but we have to be careful, because we cannot assume that the North Atlantic countries will act rationally. If they were rational actors, they would not be stirring up a storm as we speak with regard to sending Speaker Pelosi to Taiwan, which could really open the gates of hell. So we really have to be quite careful in our analysis. That is to say, just because things do not seem to be going in the direction that Washington wishes, it does not necessarily mean that they will not escalate.
Switching gears, protesters in Pakistan slam theft of ex-Prime Minister Imran Khan's mandate. Khan's party loses key vote in Punjab Assembly despite winning a by-election there in a landslide earlier in the week. What signals is this sending to you, Dr. Horne, as it relates to unrest in the region?
Well, you may recall that at the beginning of 2022, Imran Khan had made a much publicized visit to Russia, and that did not go down very well in Washington. Shortly thereafter, he was forced from office. Imran Khan charged that it was precisely because of his and his regime's reluctance to side with Washington and the European Union with regard to the Ukraine crisis. I think that Washington should tread very carefully. We know that there is continuing unrest in Afghanistan. We know that the August 2021 pullout abruptly from Afghanistan by Washington's forces was marking or did mark a real low point in Mr. Biden's popularity, because that was executed with such ham-fisted technique that a good deal of the U.S. populace lost confidence in him. So he should tread very carefully in dealing with Afghanistan's neighbor, speaking of Pakistan. And we all know as well that Pakistan's neighbor, speaking of India, supposedly is on board with the United States in confronting China, but has balked, to put it mildly, at observing sanctions against Russia. It's buying Russian oil as much as it can find at a steep discount. The relations, once again, between New Delhi and Moscow stretch back to the early days of Indian independence in 1947. And so, once again, Washington seems to be on the back foot. But once again, we should not assume that that means that they will not escalate.
That being said, if you could comment on the issue of Nancy Pelosi's supposed trip to Taiwan, it's very, very dangerous, and now the U.S. is saying they may send aircraft carriers in the area. Your thoughts?
It's quite dangerous. There have even been reports that as Nancy Pelosi's plane approaches Taiwan, that Chinese fighter jets will approach that plane and seek to escort it out of the region and prevent it from landing. Now, obviously, that could be quite dangerous. You have Nancy Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi, who's in the chain of command in Washington. She comes, if I'm not mistaken, after Kamala Harris in terms of the chain of succession after Mr. Biden and Vice President Harris. And what seems to be happening is that Washington has not accepted the signal that its posture in Ukraine is failing, and so therefore it should reconsider. Instead, it's adopting and adapting the nostrums of late Pentagon Chief Donald Rumsfeld, which is, if you have a problem, the way to deal with it is to expand the problem, because supposedly that'll change the dynamics. Now, we see where that left the United States when Mr. Rumsfeld pursued that ill-fated strategy in Iraq. It led to countless Iraqi deaths, not to mention numerous U.S. deaths. Let us hope and let us push for the reality that Washington will finally wake up to reality.
And to that, I would add, we have just about a minute and a half left. I think I'll coin this adage: don't play the game of chicken with people who don't play games.
Well, certainly. And I think this reminds me, I'm afraid to say, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I recall during the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis of approximately 60-odd years ago, and it was the considered opinion of Cuban leader Fidel Castro that it was time once and for all to settle this question of U.S. imperialism. And as a person who is on this ship of fools, I still shudder to think what that could have meant. But the problem is that Mr. Castro may be buried, but that idea was not buried with him. It remains alive in Moscow and Beijing, where there is consideration of settling this question of U.S. imperialism for all time.
Because I got to say, China isn't playing. Mess around if you want to, but I know that Joe Biden listens to this show. Joe, they are not to be trifled with. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
Folks,